hand it off.
Okay, well, as usual, I thought I'd begin with a brief summary, at least, of one of the major readings that we had, in case people didn't get to it, or just to give it a quick review. And that was the Kissel and Kim paper that was on the emergence of war. And I boiled that down to 6 key takeaways, and I thought I would share that, and then give you a very brief summary of the second article, and then open it up for discussion. So the six takeaways that I took from the Kissel and Kim paper, which was on the emergence of warfare. The first one was that when human warfare began is a pretty complex question and hard to know. The answer depends partly on how you define war, and it depends on archaeological evidence that's often absent, or if it's present, it may be hard to interpret. And there's been a long-running debate in anthropology about whether warfare is a product of more recent societies, or if it has a longer history. Secondly, when warfare began is an important question, because if warfare existed very early in human evolution, it suggests that we may be inherently warlike or prone to war. Kissel and Kim review a lot of literature, and they conclude that at least certain forms of warfare, such as ambushes and raids, existed long before the advent of large, sedentary, and politically complex societies. The Pleistocene, they say, was not the peaceful hunter-gatherer Eden that some people contend, but neither was it, at the other extreme, a blood-soaked era filled with rampant violence. The third key takeaway was that they do not see warfare as driving evolution, but rather as resulting from evolution, in particular from the cognitive changes that happened in hominids. They point out that human warfare requires certain precursors: symbolic thought, language, sophisticated forms of cooperation, all of which arose gradually throughout the Pleistocene. So their main point here is that emergent warfare coincided with the emergent capacities that made us human. In other words, warfare emerged as our humanness emerged, and the two were intertwined from the very beginning, which I think is a particularly sobering thought. I personally think they go a little too far with this, because most writers say that warfare is an important selection pressure, which actually didn't just result, but shaped both our biological and cultural evolution. The fourth key takeaway is that they stress the importance of culture in human warfare. They say it's qualitatively different from the kind of lethal intergroup violence you see in the natural world, because human warfare is not often, or not always rather, just about resource acquisition or drive for dominance, but it often stems from culturally constituted motivations, such as ideology or identity or religion. The fifth key takeaway was that while it's true that the existence of chimpanzee warfare or coalitional aggression is evidence that the origins of warfare extend back before the hominid chimpanzee split in our family tree, they caution, they say that they think that primatologists and popular science overemphasize chimpanzee warfare and downplay the overwhelming majority of chimp interactions that are more pro-social. I guess this is the anthropology version of if it bleeds, it leads. And they want us to remember that chimps are quite capable of reconciliation, which we might call peacemaking as well as war making. And that peacemaking is adaptive for any species that survive through mutual aid and cooperation. The last takeaway I got from that article is that, like chimps, humans also have evolved innate capacities, that is, adaptations for peacemaking as well as war making, and each with its own suite of thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And as with all adaptations, we have some degree of behavioral flexibility about which one gets expressed depending on the circumstances. And then very quickly, I wanted to just say the key takeaways from the second paper, which was called Bringing Science to Bear on Peace. The psychologist authors of that paper stated that we can promote peace first by understanding the beliefs and emotions that give rise to war, which they review. They talk about the self-fulfilling belief that war is inevitable, the perception of threat, and the feelings of insecurity and uncertainty that can generate, the belief that your group is superior and moral self-righteousness, and anger and fear, which leads to hatred, which leads to dehumanization, which was the subject of the documentary by the philosopher Sam Keen that I had put in the list of resources. In contrast, they then review how science indicates we could facilitate peace, and they boil it down to two clusters of activities. The first are experiences that generate empathy and understanding, and forgiveness even of the other group. And the second is by a willingness to be critical of one's own in-group. I would hasten to add, though, that those are heavy lifts, particularly in authoritarian societies, which don't promote or allow for either one of those things to be done. So with that by review, I don't have a specific question this morning, but would just like to toss it open to all of you and hear your reactions to any of the readings or videos, and or any general thoughts you have on what goes without saying is a pretty important topic. So
Well, I have a question
all right,
for
who's speaking?
Hank. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, hi Hank. Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't read enough of it, but thank you for your overview. But I was wondering about if people here or we know enough about the war and selection, because that's the part that I haven't been able to grasp yet from the brief, the literature that we just looked at. So I wonder if we could chime in on that a little bit and see what we know or where we can look to find it out, rather than it's with the emergence of symbolic thought, there's the emergence of coalitions to do good or bad. So anybody have any ideas? Or I don't know what to say. Yeah,
Diane.
Well, one of the places that we could maybe start is where we were last time, which is looking at coalitions within groups to overcome a bully or an authoritarian or something of the sort. So coalition is something that does seem to have been selected for. I mean, Steve just talked about how chimpanzees also have coalitions. People seem to within their groups. And some of the remarks that have been made, maybe I'll be repeating some of what he said. Being a good coalition partner actually is evolutionarily successful. And that depends on some of the skills and abilities that you just listed, Hank. But also, some of the things that David Buss, for example, has identified, or other people that he quotes have identified, is the idea that people also have had selected preferences for what coalition partners ought to be like. And this is particularly true for men more than women. The types of preferences, anyway, that men have is different from what women have. So men prefer, even for, a study group or something like that, some very beneficial or neutral kind of coalition, they prefer somebody who's formidable, who's strong, who has courage, and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting list of characteristics that men prefer in their group partners, because they're useful in combat.
Mm-hmm.
My quick answer
So-
to your question, Hank, would be that the costs have to outweigh the benefits. In other words, if war was selected for, which it has, the costs at some point must have outweighed the benefits. And if you watch the YouTube lecture by Michael Wilson about chimpanzee aggression, at the end of that lecture, he talks about research which finds that when chimps expand their territory at the borders slightly, it results in actually an average higher weight for all of the members of the troop and a higher birth rate as well. So that if you go back to the evolutionary roots of warfare, perhaps in our primate ancestors or relatives, I should say, it was clearly reproductively and survival wise adaptive for chimps to engage in that type of warfare. Other thoughts on Hank's question or anything else for that matter?
Well, Steve, I just want to clarify. The logic you used was that the costs outweigh the benefits. Is that what you said? Did I hear that?
Yeah.
In terms, so in warfare, I would think the benefit, this is just my own simple reaction, that the benefits would outweigh the cost.
Oh, I must have missaid. I must have misspoke. I meant that the benefits outweigh the costs.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry about
we
that.
We make it in life. So so warfare is a contribution to the survival of, I don't know about the fittest, but the survival of a certain in-group, of a certain grouping or coalition of people. They're going to make it better than the weak guys, the philosophers who have discussions or something. Is that the general? I'm just putting it together. I've not thought it out well enough.
Okay.
So
I'd like to hear other people jump in. Just you raise your virtual hand, or it might be a small enough group that you can just turn on your mic and grab it. Go ahead, Rob.
I reading this stuff have been getting the feeling that the fire sign theater was right and everything is wrong. I was under the impression, I think from reading Christopher Boehm and others, that hunter-gatherer groups in the Pleistocene were relatively violence-free, except for coalitional violence when necessary. And that warfare would be impractical for a small band of 10 to 40 people to fight with another band, because the survival of the group depends on cooperation among the group, and that the social evolution of cooperation began with the preferred survival of cooperative groups versus aggressive internecine conflict. And now it seems like warfare has become once again popular in the ever-moving orthodoxy in anthropology and archaeology. And we're now talking about everybody hurling rocks at each other.
But not in big battles, Rob, right? I mean, the type of warfare
I always forget the name of it, but the place on the Nile where they have burials with people with a lot of arrow points and obsidian knives stuck in their heads and so on suggest, but that was a raid or an ambush, and that was for resources. And certainly people will fight over resources, especially if they're scarce. Right. But hunter-gatherer bands tended to be dispersed and kind of localized in a sense of having a territory, but I just can't see that there was a lot of large-scale warfare between them. But watching the video, it seemed to imply that chimpanzees were constantly at war and devouring strangers' infants and generally acting pretty nasty. And you referred to the paper seems to suggest a more nuanced view of that. So
I think that's right, Robert.
I did just skim it, and I've been highlighting things in it because I think there's some important information in there.
Kathleen and then Diane. You're muted, Kathleen.
Sorry, I didn't watch the video, but when Rob mentioned hunter-gatherer groups, I'm thinking there's still an intermediary stage between, a small hunter-gatherer band and large-scale societies like today. So there's also this extent to which several bands become large enough that their identity starts to become more symbolic. In other words, they have a tribal identity, but the tribes have merged enough that they might all start having a certain hand signal and greeting, or wear or have some kind of decoration, so that the identity, that symbolic identity, it becomes really important for the feeling that you belong to something larger, which in turn would, help with the willingness to die for your group, the feeling that you're significant, this thing that you're dying for is significant, and that it's based on these symbolic things. And I tend to see that as contributing to war, to the extent that people's symbolic identities become something they want to preserve, and then some other large group has some other, whether it's language or something cultural, that is not perceived as human to. I'm just trying to think this. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. I think Diane and then Rich.
Yeah, I think we need to always keep in mind the multi-level selection idea. Within groups, I mean, what Kathleen is talking about, group identity and so forth, I think is key really to intergroup conflict. But within a group, there's always pressure for cooperation in the long run. Otherwise, everybody is going to suffer. So even if there's violence, like, getting rid of the bad guys or whatever, it's still essentially for the good of the group. But unless there's some kind of mutual interest, there's nothing really that pushes people to cooperate with an outgroup or one group to cooperate. I mean, the push is more for competition than for cooperation. So if there's resistance against, whatever you're trying to accomplish for your group, violence is the next level. And people having identity, language, all these different characteristics that make it easy for them to create coalitions, very strongly cooperative coalitions, then obviously it's easy to turn into conflict on both sides. And I've been a little bit involved in some studies of how peace can be promoted. And actually, I think social scientists tend to be a little bit optimistic about this. You talked about the moving consensus within anthropology. And I think that centers basically around the problem of whether evolutionary roots equal determinism. And so there are people who are just determined to show that human beings are not, that they're not biologically determined to have war, that's possible not to have war. So sometimes they get the upper hand, and then sometimes the people who say it's inevitable for one reason or another will get the other upper hand. I think that's why it shifts all over the place. Like
Anthropological hawks and doves.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to Rich and then Rob. Thank you, Diane.
Hi, I think you can hear me.
Yes.
When I think about war, I inevitably go to violence, thinking about violence, and then from there, threat processing, and from there to neurological design on how we process threats and so forth. So it's very individual, human-centered approach. But what I said in my chat is not really that. I guess because I think about the neurobiological way we process threats and tribal identity and all of this stuff. I look for the evolutionary development of those traits and the parallel expression of violence in animals, prior to having those traits, and then how violence is expressed for us or apes or higher level that may have more of those neurobiological processing going on. Anyway, it led me to think that one way to look at war is that to contrast animals where there's violence going on, but it's often seen anyway from science that it's an avoidance. The goal is dominance. It's not actually to kill the other animal. And the reason I've been told on this, it mostly revolves around killing is just is too much energy to expend for the goal at hand, which is really just dominance. Whereas war, to me, seems like we make as our goal, at least as like a tribal goal, the actual elimination of actual killing, elimination of others, even from a distance. And so those kind of things really require a lot of things that I think are uniquely human.
Rich, you might be interested at the end of the Michael Wilson lecture, which was the YouTube, one of the YouTube lectures, the YouTube lecture. He put one of the questions he addresses. So his talk is on chimpanzees, and one of the questions he asks is, why do they kill people? Why do they kill chimps from another troop rather than just chase them away? And the answer is because it's really low cost for them to do it, because they only do that kind of killing when they have overwhelming numerical superiority, usually an 8-to-1 ratio. So at least in terms of our ancestors, he says the reason that they kill rather than just dominate and chase them away is that it's very low cost for them to do that. So it kind of related to what you were saying, Rich. I think Rob, Joe, and Hank. Rob, you're muted.
Hard to remember that. The low cost among chimps. There were two things that occurred to me. One is that chimp societies are larger than hunter-gatherer bands generally. And so their territory is a motivator towards increasing it at the edges. The other thing that struck me was that we are a social species, and like dogs, we are domesticated according to Wrangham in the goodness paradox. So we have juvenile character, pedomorphism, which means extended neoteny and development and more playful. But the difference that happens when we started to coalesce into larger groups, and people are using the word tribe a lot, a tribal group is larger, and they tend to form coalitions of tribes that will then, like the Iroquois Confederation, that will, dominate and kill and eat enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a major shift in human development, and partly the result of agriculture and sedentism. So I think there's a big difference between thinking about Paleolithic warfare or non-warfare or violence, which, as Diane says, is based on coalitions to get rid of bullies and tyrants. That's the execution hypothesis, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to point out that the sociality of human beings, which drives us towards cooperation in small groups, also drives us towards mass warfare in large groups.
Yeah. One comment I would like to make, if people will allow me to jump in, even though it's true, I think the overwhelming consensus now from the articles I've read is that there was warfare of a kind, like chimpanzee type warfare among hunter-gatherers, that it predates agriculture and politically complex and large sedentary societies. But that doesn't mean that when that major evolutionary transition was made to those type of societies, that doesn't mean that warfare didn't escalate and change. And one of the things that I thought earlier when Kathleen was talking, I think it was Kathleen was talking about, why, what incentive is there to cooperate with another hunter-gatherer tribe? When there was need for trade, when your tribe had something that I want, but my tribe doesn't have, that would have increased the incentive to do some cooperation and trading. And I don't know this for a fact, but my thought would be that it wasn't until the advent probably of agriculture and more complex societies that there might have been an increase in incentive for trading. I think that perhaps before that, the hunter-gatherer tribes may have had pretty similar things, and you didn't have much that I didn't have, so I didn't have incentive to trade. But I'm not sure of that. I want to go to Joe and then Hank and then back to Rob.
Well, I don't know if I'm the only veteran here, but I am a veteran. And this weekend's Memorial Day, so I'm trying to bring it more to the here and now and to the future, if anyone else wants to go there. The reason I'm participating in this group is, as well as PC World, etc., is to improve the chances that people born today, 2023, get to die natural deaths. I don't think that's a given. I'm talking worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to go with, all right, so how would we specific? Memorial Day is to honor those who died in America's wars, going back to the Revolution. So as opposed to all veterans, just those who died. Veterans Day has two purposes, and one of which has been forgotten. When it was initially created, it was after World War I, the Great War, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it was to promote peace, to promote worldwide peace. Armistice Day.
Yeah. Initially, it was Armistice Day, right?
Armistice Day, correct. And then after Korea and World War II, we realized, well, World War I really wasn't the Great War anymore, and the additional to honor veterans was added to promote peace. And if you look now at Veterans Day, it's all about honoring veterans and very little to promote peace, even though statute in the law, I'm not making this up, but in the law you'll see both purposes are now the purposes for Veterans Day.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so where am I kind of go with this? What can we be doing in this circle or elsewise to say in the here and now, what can we be doing to culturally change how we look at ourselves, but also how we behave individually and collectively to, reduce the chances of a nuclear war or all these wars that are going on around the world today. I just have that as a mindset as opposed to, I guess I haven't studied anthropology,
Joe, if you didn't have a chance to read the paper that was posted for this group today about bringing science to bear on peace, I would, the PDF should still be available. I thought it was a really very good article addressing the topic that you're raising, is how can we use what we understand about human behavior and evolutionary science to bring about peace.
I'll look at it. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. And I think that'd be a great topic for us to talk about at some point too, as well as the past. Joe's raising an important point. Let's talk about the future as well as the past. Hank and then Kathleen.
Yeah, I want to come from a position of having trained as a psychoanalyst. And some of you might be familiar with this, some may not, but the whole notion of whether it starts with Freud or particular Melanie Klein, I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but if I can summarize it, there's a hypothesis. What it's based upon, I don't know, that what's embedded in our ancient brain, I'm just giving you the simple version, is kill or be killed. And Melanie Klein gave it a name. She called it the paranoid schizoid position. So the people who are more troubled, have more problems, more prone to violence, more prone to outbursts, they're considered, they've never left the paranoid schizoid position. Then she comes up with a notion called the depressive position, which is the highest level that humankind can achieve, which is that you begin to feel bad for hurting somebody. And you want to atone for it. You want to be nice to them. Everybody with kids probably has seen it. Oh, I'm sorry, mommy or daddy. So I'm just wondering if I've never looked at it from an evolutionary or a more scientific perspective, because a lot of people, before me, let's say since the 1900s or later, have taken in this construct, at least in those schooled in that kind of classical, early kind of Freudian classical psychoanalytic realm. So just wanted to point it out. It's kind of exists in this sort of coalition of tribes of people who call them psychoanalysts or Kleinians or somebody like that.
Yeah, well, certainly at a bare minimum, the tradition of psychodynamic theory has been concerned with destructiveness and our destructive urges, as well as our loving urges. So it certainly wrestled with both. I don't know if it's done it explicitly in the context of looking at coalitional aggression and war compared to just more on an individual level. But Kathleen, go jump in.
I'm going to try to link that to what Joe was saying about, I think it was Joe, what about now? What about the future? So taking up what Hank just said about the you kill or be killed as this gets paranoid position. I'm thinking of a recent talk given by Jonathan Haidt. He says, if you shoot your critic, you shoot yourself in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And he's linking democracy. You need democracy to avoid war. And in order to have democracy, you need to be able to tolerate that other who differs from yourself without thinking that it's got to be a fight to the death. And this is why we're in such trouble right now. So, I mean, I guess it's no news to say peace might depend on democracy, but I just thought this was an interesting way of linking Joe's concern, I thought, to what Hank just said. And I'm sorry, I can't recall it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago the video appeared, and I can't give you more information.
That's really helpful. I would add to that the whole notion of not dehumanizing your enemy. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to pay the $2.99 and watch the old 1987 documentary that I had put as a resource done by Sam Keane about dehumanizing the enemy, but I would highly recommend it. It holds up pretty well, and the gist of it is that what soldiers need to do in war to be able to kill another human being is to dehumanize that person, and that they have to be able to dehumanize the enemy to kill the enemy. And certainly in disagreeing with people that have different viewpoints about politics. At times when it gets pretty vicious, it pretty much nibbles up at the edges of saying that the person you disagree with is evil, and almost dehumanization, maybe not quite. And other thoughts? Anybody who's just listening and hasn't jumped in yet, have any thoughts, please do so. Otherwise, we'll go to Rob.
Hank, I was thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of what motivates violence. And the idea that large groups have a very abstract idea of why they go to war. The chimpanzees obviously are concerned with resources. And in hunter-gatherer groups, it's probably access to mating opportunities or immediate food. This is sort of basic, but as societies become more complex, the signaling that Kathleen mentioned, the hats and I used to say history's all about hats, that, how you signal where you are in relationship to the ideals or the values of a society, can have an impact on your status in the society and so on. So, but big wars, I mean, we're looking at Putin's motivations for going to war with Ukraine, and they seem quaint. I mean, 19th century, just not up to date. And yet they still linger in there. So it's a social construct. And I'm again I was thinking about multi-level evolution. These things are evolving in uneven, at uneven speeds. So I very much like the idea of working on peace. I think maybe that'd be the next one.
Yeah, there's a part of me that wants to say that there's some part of our species that enjoys this. I'm going to a baseball game, a Major League Baseball game tomorrow, and sports basically is playfully sublimating warfare. It's two tribes with going back to Kathleen's point, different uniforms, right? Different signals you send about what tribe you're in, and it's all for fun, but it is appealing, I think, to in some way it's appealing to the same sort of tribal aggressive, we're going to win, we're going to beat you down, at any rate. Hank and then Joe, I think, and then Russ. I think I've got the order correct.
In this discussion, I got to thinking about when, I forget who just mentioned dehumanization, but I was thinking, now let's see if I get it right. Is there selection for dehumanization, and what is the cost benefit of dehumanization from a multi-level selection? Would be the
Well, if you dehumanize your enemy, it's easier to kill them. That's how I would.
Right. So that we're talking about this. Who knows? But there's multi-level selection, and in that is dehumanization some kind of evolutionary adaptation? So those are the.
That's an interesting way to look at it, Hank. That to some, that's a very interesting way to phrase it. I'm going to go to Joe and then Russell and then Kathleen.
Well, a brief comment. I listen to books on Audible. Used to say tape, now it's on an iPod. I listened to the book "They Will Sell Us the Rope," which fictional history of the 1907 communist, whatever the party meeting was in London, where Stalin, who had been Stalin, later renamed Stalin, attended, and kind of following him there. But with respect to the Ukraine war, I'm going to go with this. They will sell us the rope. I think an essential part of this war is Putin and his cronies trying to disguise the fact they've stolen several $1 trillion from the Russian people with the help of the West, bankers, brokers, yacht dealers, art dealers. And so when the Russian people are saying why this, why that, you can say, go to war. That tends to unite, evolutionary theory tends to unite a people.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I going with it is that, so these Western bankers, brokers, whoever, had they, this was not all legal, but they did not blow whistles, knowing that the blow whistles would be futile and, and would impact them and their tribe. So I keep banging on the drum. We need to have more trustworthy institutions. Trustworthy institutions need viable whistleblower systems, and we don't have them today. And that would be including to arms control. No arms control treaty talks about whistleblower disclosure, whistleblower protection schemes. Why not? We can't trust you. Well, people will say, well, because we're trying to do treaties with authoritarian governments, they won't do that. And I say, we don't have that in America either. Okay, so why don't we in America say, oh, we're going to unilaterally put some whistleblower disclosure, whistleblower protection parts, and we'll just unilaterally put them into the treaties for us.
Well,
And then we could say, oh, now we're being exceptional, as opposed to just we're exceptional, so I don't have to follow any other rules of the nations. I'm on my high holy, excuse me.
Well, what to put this in back sort of into a anthropology context, Joe, what I hear you kind of nibbling up against is that in the modern context, we have very complex, large-scale social institutions which play a role and contribute to intergroup conflict and potentially war. And those institutions would have not existed in the ancestral past, and even in when state societies first began, they would have been a lot simpler.
Right.
So I think Joe is raising an important kind of contemporary, contextual, and political context. Russell, you've been very, very patient with your virtual hand up for quite a while, so please go ahead.
Well, that is absolutely okay, because the discussion has been so stimulating. I'm happy to be patient while I'm learning so much, and I hope my comment comes around to connecting to these critical contemporary issues that Joe has been raising. But I keep thinking in relation to this dehumanization issue and its importance of the way that Jared Diamond begins his book, The World Before Yesterday, which is in his first chapter with a walk, recounting a walk in the New Guinea highlands with a hunter-gatherer leader who is talking, who he knows well, and who is talking about the people, or I don't think he called them people, but the folks that lived on the other side of the ridge, and describes them as essentially non-people, or using very dehumanizing language. And Diamond goes on to really make that a central issue about human as humans. Evolution as including this propensity to categorize people as human or not human, even though, of course, from an evolutionary standpoint, they're all human. Mark Moffat's book, I don't know if it's gotten a lot of attention, but it's pretty recent, and it's quite fascinating, called The Human Swarm. He essentially kind of, goes one step beyond the way that we, or at least I usually think of multi-level selection theory in terms of, the logic of cooperation in groups and versus the logic of competition between individuals, and really focuses a lot more attention on this issue of larger groupings. And as I think Kathleen noted, the tribes being much more inclusive than just the kind of groups that are usually thought of in multi-level selection theory as needing to cooperate and benefiting from that. And then Moffat suggests that there is a real evolved propensity to identify with an in-group and an out-group, and if you look through early human history, what you find is always identification of a people, and conversely,
Yes,
people who are not people. But it seems to me that the problem that I think, and the solution here is that the human brain is very capable of creating these larger constructs and putting together, a notion of people versus non-people, but that's done in relation to all kinds of environmental conditions and advantages and disadvantages. And therefore, it's also, as Sharif pointed out in the Robbers Cave experiment that we all like to talk about, I think, that notion of identity is really one that is socially constructed. And
Russell, I'm going to
reason that we can't push the envelope bigger and bigger and more inclusive.
Two quick reactions, and then to go to Kathleen. I think that many indigenous tribes call themselves the people in their own language, and so that implies, if my tribe is the people, other tribes are something else. It also makes me think of two other books that I'm going to mention. One would be Peter Singer's book, The Expanding Circle, which talks about, he's a philosopher and talks about how over the course of human history, who we define as us has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And personally, I think that's the way out of this dilemma, is that if we begin to define everyone on the planet as in the same tribe we're in, that may be a way out. And there is a book about to come out, and I have not read the book yet. It's being published, I think, next Tuesday, by David Sampson, and it's called Our Tribal Future. And the subtitle is How to Make Tribalism the Solution Rather Than the Problem. Yes, and he is going to be giving a talk on pro-social world in September. And so you might want to check out that book and register for the talk that he's going to be giving. Very interesting stuff, I think. Kathleen.
Well, I just want to say Russell expressed so much of what I was thinking. So thank you for doing the work I would have had to do in that sense. I was going back to the question of how it is we dehumanize. And that's why Russell's reasoning was very helpful to me. Actually, the moment we start thinking of other individuals in symbolic terms, rather than as personal individuals, that is already creating an abstraction in our minds, which I think has the potential to dehumanize people, even when it's benevolent. And the question of individual selection in relation to multi-selection, I think it can't be discounted. We are all capable of turning other people into abstractions. We do it on a daily basis just to get through the day. We have our things to do, and maybe I'm speaking too much from the weird perspective, but I think at an individual level, it is in us. I don't want to say frightens, but what's concerning to me is the ease with which people rise to power, precisely because they go around abstracting most other people as the little people, right? So that the top 1%, they tend to identify with one another as people, and everyone else is an abstraction. And so even if you get rid of war, there are other kinds of violence under authoritarianism that I find very frightening.
Kathleen, I don't know if you're a fan of Succession on HBO, But if you want to see a depiction of how the top 1%, treat and feel about the 99% below them. Of course, that's a dramatization, but it's pretty pointed at the way they enacted in that series. Diane.
Let Hank go first.
Okay, Hank.
Yeah, I have another, I'm coining a word based upon some of my studies, and I'm going to call it the, just give me a second, pre-humanization.
P-R-E?
Yeah, I'm basing it on, again, psychodynamic conceptualization. This is not science. This is,
Okay.
and the idea is, let's see, I can summarize it. The theory about the infant, obviously I'm trying to get away from the fancy lingo, which is my shorthand, but the infant is not capable for quite a while, and neither are children, and maybe never are humans fully developed, capable of experiencing another person as a reasonably separate human being with their own interest, with a certain degree of compassion. That's my summary of it. Now, so the baby eventually, through socialization and development, becomes humanized. So there's a pre-humanization level of development.
Yeah, the way I would translate that is, another way I think to say that, Hank, if you'll allow me, is that babies are not born empathic. That empathy is a developmental task that has to be achieved. Empathy, if you define empathy as being able to have a theory of mind and understand that the other person, is a human and all of those sorts of things.
Right. Let me just say one thing, and I'll go. But that empathy, at its basis, based on Franz de Waal and a few others, is not about, it's not a higher level, but it's the capacity to imitate and walk in the other's shoes on an imitation level, not at a. So that's it. So that's about this dehumanization. Like, where do we go with all this?
Mirror neurons take a little while to develop.
That's right. Yeah.
Diane, Rich, and then I think Sage is going to jump in. He signed back on. So.
Right. I just wanted to respond to what Kathleen was saying by saying that maybe we should, at some point, start thinking about peace and what is, are we more interested in peacemaking, or are we more interested in peace building, because those are rather different concepts. One requires an active search for mutual interests, essentially, but the other one is recognition that the kinds of inequalities that Kathleen was talking about, that is, peace building requires doing something about the structural problems that exist between groups.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
And also peace is more than just the absence of war.
Yes.
Rich.
Okay, hi. Responding to Kathleen and Hank. Going back to Kathleen, we talked about tribal identity issues, and I read somewhere that the way to think about tribal identity, in part, is that it's limited to quite a small size. Somewhere I read that it's about 40. Now, I don't know why it wasn't 50 or 30, but that we have an ability to identify with a tribe of no more than 40 individuals. And the thought was that it's because, prior to modern life, we were visually interacting and seeing and interacting with up to 40. And that this remains with us today, so that asking us to identify with a number of people bigger than 40 is difficult. It requires other parts of our brain, and is it may even be a threat, because what's in the past is you're outside the 40 years, you're in somebody else's, you're in an out group. So it's difficult for us to, to live peacefully or to think pro-socially about groups that are bigger than 40. Hank, what were you? Oh shoot. Hank was talking about, I'll raise my hand again. I'm sorry. It'll come back.
We probably are nearing time and need to wrap up. I will mention, speaking about dehumanization, some of you long timers remember that we did a session on dehumanization back. I don't remember how many. We've had 32 or 33 of these now, so I forget when that was. But Sage has all of the videos archived, and there was a session on dehumanization that people could go back and rewatch if you want to. Sage, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Great, thanks, Steve. I really enjoyed listening to this one today. Yeah, I wouldn't get too hung up on the exact number that Dunbar had. I've seen some stuff that says let's not hang our hat on that too much.
It depends partly on how you define a tribe, and I think there are tribes and meta tribes maybe is the way out of it, but yeah.
Yeah, there's some obviously boundedness, but we don't know it to the just before we wrap up, as attendees, we all get a chance to vote on what we spend our time together doing next time. I just saw an entry here from Joe Carson on whistleblowing. So I threw that in there, and a couple of these were from last session and a couple of these are new. Joe, did you want to just say one or two sentences on what you were thinking there?
Well, I think whistleblowing is an extreme form of altruism, and I think we need, looking forward, we need to have more people willing to be engaged in such extremely altruistic activities to have more trustworthy societal institutions to improve the chances we can avoid war and other the other challenging, if not existential, threats we face as a civilization. So,
Sage, you're missing a suggestion that I had submitted, which was the topic of adaptive fictions.
Oh, I saw that.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, let me put that in there too. Thanks, Steve. That was tucked under.
So we're to click on that link and vote is what you want us to do, right?
That's right, but give me 1 second just to
Okay.
toss in the adaptive fictions option there. All right. And maybe it'll show that option if you refresh, or here's the link again. Maybe click that one.
Yeah, I don't know if my iPad shows it, but
No, mine is not. Yes.
So vote for whatever you like, and if you wanted to vote for adaptive fictions and don't see it, we can make note of that.
If you refresh, it comes up.
Yeah, refresh.
It does?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Here we go. There's no box for it. Sorry.
It's in the middle.
I have to go. Surprise me. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, there it is. Good. All right.
It is true, I guess, that once you get the vote in, you're free to go.
yeah, and again, I don't see how I can vote, so I'll say whistleblowing if you take it audibly.
It's in the chat there, but maybe
chat. Okay, let me see if I can find it.
Joe, you should be aware that the way things work now, since Andy Norman stepped down as leader of this group, is that if your topic is selected, you get to run the session. So that means you would
Right.
facilitate the discussion and send out some readings and things of that nature. So
Okay, no, I figured as much. Thank you, Steve.
thanks for clarifying, Steve. Yeah, that's we're shifting as a group here. Okay, so I'll just show you. It looks like we've got human synchrony 5 votes, adaptive fiction 4 votes, couple votes for whistleblowing, neuroplasticity, third again. So, yeah, I actually just thought of the human synchrony one from some notes. I was looking over what I thought of, and sort of a boundary idea, a little bit in the kind of shooting in the dark a little bit, but I think it's kind of in that zone. All right, now we got a tie vote with adaptive fictions. Up to you, Steve. Want me to take this one, next one, or you want to run?
Yeah,
it?
why don't we just pick the next 2? You do the next month and I'll do adaptive fictions in 2 months.
All right.
Sound good?
Great.
That's great.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to new people. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.